Carthage and Sicily, 735 to 310 BC. Wars between Carthage and Sicilian Greeks. First appearance of Greeks in Sicily. Their gradual spread. Battle of Himera. Second Carthaginian invasion of Sicily. Third invasion and its incidents. Exploits of Dionysius. Siege of Mortier. Fourth invasion. Strange vicissitudes and possible importance of the conflict. Comparative merits of Greek and Carthaginian rule in Sicily. Conflicting stories about Hamilcar at Himera. River Halesus fixed as boundary. Timoleon. Magnificent Carthaginian armament. Battle of Crimesus. Agathocles invades Africa and threatens Carthage. Before we enter on the history of the long struggle between the Romans and Carthaginians for the possession of Sicily, it is necessary to give some account of the less known and much longer series of wars which had been waged for the same object between the Carthaginians and the Greeks. Our knowledge of these wars comes to us, as was to be expected, exclusively from Greek sources. And the same caution with which we receive from the Roman writers indiscriminate charges of cruelty and of bad faith against their formidable antagonists in the Punic Wars is necessary, perhaps even more necessary, here. If we cannot often prove that the charges brought are groundless, we can at least always remember that they are one-sided. The light thrown by the Sicilian wars on the inner life of the Carthaginians is scanty enough, but where our materials are so meager, we must make the best of even that little. In some facts, at least, come out which are alike interesting and suggestive. From very early times, as we have seen, the Phoenicians had occupied every coign of vantage on the coast of Sicily and its adjacent islands, and had from thence carried on their peaceful warfare with the natives of the interior. But about the 8th century, a still more adventurous and gifted people appeared upon the scene. The Phoenicians, true to their general policy to attempt to hold nothing by war which they could not hold without it, and to trade with those countries only where trade was its own passport and its own security, retired gradually before the incomers, and would very possibly have disappeared altogether from the island had not Carthage, endowed as she was with all the colonizing and commercial aptitudes of Tyre, as well as with a capacity for empire which Tyre never had, stepped into the place which the mother city declined to fill, and entered upon that vigorous and aggressive policy which was one day to make the Western Mediterranean a Carthaginian lake. But the spread of the Greek colonies in Sicily was not rapid. Naxos and Syracuse, Catana and Leontini had been founded on its western coast for perhaps half a century before we hear of the Greeks at Gela, nor was it till another half century or thereabouts had passed away that we find them at Himera, and Selinus threatening or seeming to threaten the Carthaginians in the western corner of the island to which they had retreated. But Carthage was still peacefully inclined. She loved a quiet life, and it was not till after Mago, about 530 BC, had extended her home domain in Africa, until Mago's son Hasdrubal had annexed Sardinia, that any serious attempt was made by her to recover the ground which had been lost. At the head of a vast and motley army, drawn from all the countries to which the Carthaginian fleets had access, Hamilcar, the second son of Mago, landed in Sicily in the year 480. The great battle of Himera lasted from morning to evening, and it ended as we have already seen in the complete rout of the Carthaginians. Hamilcar, who throughout the battle had in his twofold capacity of Shafit and commander in chief, been sacrificing to the gods of Carthage, when he found that his efforts were of no avail, disappeared and was seen no more. The Carthaginians, with characteristic prudence, fell back once again on the three original Phoenician fortresses of Motier, Panormus, and Soleis, and from their retirement there looked on complacently for the next 70 years at the incessant revolutions and counter revolutions which were as the breath of life to their ever restless yet ever prosperous Greek neighbors. At last, in BC 410, the half native and half Trojan city of Egesta, which by its appeal to Athens for aid against Selinus, had brought on Sicily and Greece alike the calamities of the Syracusan expedition, made a similar appeal to Carthage, and so kindled the flames of that new war, or rather series of wars, which, with fitful intermissions, devastated the island for a century and a half. The Carthaginians hesitated long, we are told, before renewing the venture which 70 years before had ended so disastrously. But at last the die was cast. It was an evil day for the Greek cities of Sicily. Hannibal, grandson of the Hamilcar, who had fallen at Himera, and therefore, as Diodorus remarks, a born enemy of the Greeks, took the command. Selinus fell almost at the first attack. Its inhabitants were slaughtered and its splendid walls and temples leveled with the ground. The majestic columns, which it was long thought that nothing but an earthquake could have overthrown, still show, it is said, marks of the Carthaginian crowbars which were used to overturn them. Himera shared the fate of Selinus. To a message from the Syracusans begging that he would admit his prisoners to ransom and spare at least the temples of the gods, Hannibal replied that those who could not preserve their freedom must try their hands at slavery. The gods had already shown their anger with them by leaving their towns. Then, in an outburst of fanaticism, half family and half national, he slaughtered 3,000 prisoners in cold blood on the spot on which his grandfather had fallen. Goodness. Sated with plunder and bloodshed, Hannibal sailed back to Africa, but only to return 3 years later to complete his work of devastation. The splendid city of Agrigentum, with its vast population, its prodigious temples, and its innumerable works of art, fell after a siege of 7 months. The towns of Gela and Camarina came next, and from the whole southern coast of Sicily, Greek culture and civilization seemed to be blotted out. We turn away with disgust from the details of so savage and barbarous a warfare. But we must note as we pass one or two of its more characteristic and suggestive incidents. Such are the mutiny of Campanian mercenaries quelled by the present of the rich gold and silver drinking cups which the bodyguard of the Carthaginian general had brought with them. The wanton destruction of the Agrigentine sepulchres by the besieging army, the religious terrors which followed, the heaven sent pestilence, the spectres of the outraged dead haunting the sentries at their posts, and the solemn sacrifice of a child to Baal by the general in command, the glorious works of art, the statue of Artemis at Egesta, of the poet Stesichorus at Himera, of Apollo at Gela, of the bull of Phalaris at Agrigentum, carried off to Carthage or to Tyre. In vain did the Syracusans try to stave off the storm by sending troops halfway to meet it. In vain did they depose their incapable generals and bow their necks beneath the yoke of the one man who, in point of courage and ability, seemed to be marked out as the savior of their state, the tyrant Dionysius. Syracuse itself, the acknowledged head of the Greek cities of Sicily, seemed about to fall. But the ravages of the pestilence, which carried off half the Carthaginian army, compelled Hannibal to leave his task unfinished, and he returned to Africa carrying with him the pestilential taint which was to spread havoc in Carthage and its neighborhood. It was now the turn of Dionysius to justify his assumption of arbitrary power by the use he made of it, and after a few years of strenuous preparation, he set forth on his mission of liberation. Every species of cruelty which had been visited by the barbarous mercenaries of Carthage on the unhappy Greeks was now atoned for by the equally unhappy Carthaginians who had settled in the southern parts of Sicily. Onward the tide of invasion flowed, swollen as it advanced by the Greeks, who were now able to return to their devastated homes, till at length it reached the westernmost corner of the island and found itself checked by the narrow arm of sea which separates the island fortress of Motai from the mainland. The small garrison of Motier defended itself with all the resolution of the Phoenician race, and the incidents of the siege which followed, the mole thrown out by Dionysius to connect it with the mainland, the battering of its walls by new and unheard of military engines, such as the catapult, just then invented, the huge moving towers, the diversions effected by the fleets, the final assault, the desperate house to house fighting in the narrow streets, the flight for refuge to the temples of the gods, the promiscuous pillage and massacre. All these incidents are characteristic of the Phoenicians when driven to stand at bay and remind us in some measure now of the heroic resistance made in the following century by the parent of Phoenician cities to Alexander the Great, and now again of that still more terrible resistance of despair to which this history leads us up, and in which it finds its most tragic conclusion. The Liberator had all but done his work, but these were not the days when we know Carthage best. The days of her vacillation and of half hearted counsels, they were the days of her strength and of her pride. In spite of the havoc wrought by the plague in Carthage and the surrounding country, another huge host of 1 lakh men started under Himilco for Sicily. They recovered Eryx and Motier almost at a blow, and within the course of a single year took Messana at the other end of Sicily and rolled back the tide of invasion on Syracuse itself. Seldom has the fortune of war veered round so rapidly and so completely. But the marshes of the Anapus were once more the best and the last ally of Syracuse. A new pestilence of unexampled fury broke out. Part of the Carthaginian navy was destroyed by fire, and Himilco purchased the safety of the remaining Carthaginians in his army by the betrayal of all his mercenaries. It was an act of baseness of which Dionysius himself and even Hero after him were also guilty, and it is not without parallel in the history of the Punic Wars, but it enables us in some measure to explain what is otherwise so difficult to account for: the sudden collapse of the energies of Carthage when, once and again, she seemed to be in the full career of success. It is useless to speculate, but it is hardly possible to resist the temptation to do so as to what might have been the consequence to Carthage, to Sicily itself, to Rome, and to the world at large, had either party succeeded altogether in the attempt in which each had all but succeeded within the term of these last 3 years. Had Carthage, for instance, been able to push forward her victorious career into Italy at the very time when the Gaul was at the gates of Rome, or had Syracuse been able to accomplish with ease in a single year what could hardly be accomplished a century and a half later in a 23 years war by all the power of Rome? It is impossible to say what might have been the result in such a case, but it is possible to point out much at least which could hardly have happened, and to realize to ourselves how entirely different the conditions would have been under which the struggle for a universal empire, whoever might have been the combatants, must have been carried on. The horrors perpetrated by the Carthaginians and the ferocity and treachery of some of their generals are brought out into full relief by Diodorus and by the earlier Sicilian historians Philistus and Timaeus, who form his chief authorities. It is all the more important, therefore, to notice that Diodorus himself inadvertently drops hints which show that if the merits of Greek and Carthaginian rule in Sicily must needs be compared, the advantage was not always, in the judgment of the Sicilians themselves, on the side of the Greeks. Many of the Sicilian Greeks, he tells us, migrated of their own free will, carrying their property with them from the Greek to the Carthaginian portion of Sicily, for they found, or fancied at least, that they would find the rule of Carthage to be less oppressive than that of the tyrant Dionysius. On the other hand, many Sicanians and Sicilians, whom Dionysius offered to transfer to Syracuse from the neighborhood of the Carthaginians, declined his offer with thanks, preferring the Carthaginian rule to his. While those tribes or towns which he had compelled to join him went back again with alacrity to Carthage as soon as she reappeared on the scene. In like manner, when at a moment's notice Dionysius plundered the property of all Carthaginians resident in Syracuse, it is clear that the Carthaginians, in spite of the provocation they had received, did not make reprisals on the Greek residents in Carthage. These indications may tend to strengthen the misgivings which are naturally suggested to us when we recollect the medium through which alone our information as to Carthaginian misgovernment comes. There is another circumstance which is still more suggestive. Of what followed the fatal battle of Himera, we have two versions. One of them, by a lucky chance, which is almost without a parallel in the history of these wars, comes from the Carthaginians themselves. It has been preserved by Herodotus and tells us that Hamilcar, when he found that the battle of Himera had gone against him, flung himself headlong as a whole burnt offering into the fire which he had kindled, and that almost divine honors were paid to his memory by a grateful country, alike in Sicily and in the capital. The other version is that given us by the Greeks, that the Carthaginians, unable to vent their anger even on the lifeless corpse of the unfortunate Hamilcar by nailing it, as they sometimes did in similar cases, to a cross, vented it on his innocent son Gascon, whom they banished for life to the Greek town of Selinus. Either of these stories, or neither of them, or both of them, inconsistent as they seem with each other, may, among a people so volatile as the Carthaginians, perhaps be true. But the discrepancy is at least suggestive, and it does not make us less sorry that in other cases, where we hear of anything to the discredit of Carthage, we are unable to balance the Greek by the Carthaginian version of the story. Other desultory attempts were made by the tyrant Dionysius in his long reign of 38 years to drive the Carthaginians from Sicily, but without success. And the fitful struggle ended in a treaty which assigned to Carthage all the territory which lay to the west of the river Halisus. This river practically remained the boundary between the contending parties for the next 100 years. But on two occasions during that period, the Carthaginians appeared in arms before the walls of Syracuse. The first was in the time of the best, the other of the worst of all its rulers. Already the Carthaginians had gained possession of the whole of the town of Syracuse, except its island citadel of Ortygia, when the younger Dionysius, a man as weak as he was wicked, made way for the Corinthian Timoleon. Equally remarkable for his courage and his gentleness, for his ability to command and his readiness to obey, for the tenderness of his affections and the sternness of his sense of duty, above all for his absolute disinterestedness Timoleon is the highest ideal of one side, and that perhaps the noblest side of the Greek character. He had saved his brother's life in battle at the risk of his own, and yet, when that brother plotted against the lives and liberties of his fellow citizens, he gave him over in an access of sublime patriotism to the death he had deserved. Such was the man who, summoned to an arduous post which he would never have sought but dared not decline, now appeared at Syracuse when its fortunes were at its lowest ebb in BC 344. The Carthaginians vanished for the time, but reappeared a few years afterwards at the head of one of the most splendid armaments that they had ever put into the field. It consisted of 70,000 infantry, of 10,000 cavalry, of a large number of war chariots drawn by 4 horses each, of 100 ships of war, and 1,000 transports laden with supplies and ammunition of every kind. But the armament was not less remarkable for its composition than its size. The merchant princes of Carthage, so often content to look at war as a gigantic mercantile speculation, cared not, as a rule, to risk their own lives when there were plenty of barbarians who, for a small sum of money, were willing to throw away theirs instead. It was doubtless pleasanter for those who enjoyed life, as did the wealthy Carthaginians, when there was any risk to be run, to do so, as the Greek proverb expresses it, in the in the person of a carrion. But when real danger threatened the state, it is a mere calumny to assert that they were not ready to battle in their own persons and to fight, as their mercenaries hardly ever fought in defense of their hearths and homes. In this preeminently patriotic armament, there were, we are told, no less than 10,000 native Carthaginians, all clad in splendid panoplies and all carrying white shields, conspicuous from afar, as if to mark them out as targets for the enemy. Amongst them was the famous sacred band of 2,500 chosen nobles in all the bravery of their gold rings, their costly raiment, and their drinking vessels of solid gold and silver. The battle which ensued, the Battle of the Crimesus, is described with graphic detail by Diodorus and Plutarch, who evidently had the testimony of eyewitnesses before them. We seem, as we read, to be moving in an atmosphere of poetry and of portent, of miracle and of religious enthusiasm. It is the battle of Megiddo and the brook Kishon that we fancy that we see. It is the song of triumph of Deborah and of Barak that we fancy that we hear. The parallel is close indeed throughout. A tempest of rain and hail, accompanied by lightning and thunder, broke with extraordinary violence at the critical moment, right in the faces of the advancing Carthaginians. The stars in their courses fought against Carthage, and the brook Crimesus, swollen in a few minutes to an angry torrent, swept away in its waters the war chariots and the plunging horses and the heavy armed foot soldiers of the Carthaginians. Then, as at Megiddo, strength was broken down. The Carthaginian citizens in their heavy panoplies slipped in the mud and fell to rise no more. The sacred band stood their ground by the confession of the Greeks themselves in a manner worthy of their privileges and responsibilities, and died fighting bravely to a man. The camp and costly baggage fell into the hands of the victors, and Timoleon, laden with booty and with honor, returned to Syracuse to live there as a simple citizen, and after securing to his adopted country a period of 22 years of prosperity and liberty and peace, such as it hardly enjoyed either before or since, to be regretted in his death as the common father and benefactor of all the Sicilians. Timoleon passed away, and Syracuse once more fell in BC 310 under the yoke of a tyrant as able and as unscrupulous as the elder Dionysius. Bursting through the Carthaginian squadron, which was blockading him in his capital, with a heroism which is almost unparalleled in warfare, Agathocles made his way at the head of a few ships to Africa, and with a Carthaginian fleet following close behind him and a Carthaginian army ready to receive him on his landing, he made Carthage herself tremble for her safety. Once again, the city poured forth in its own defense its hoplites and its horsemen, its war chariots, and its sacred band. But it was not till after Agathocles had been for 3 years overrunning the open country, till he had occupied an almost fabulous number of Carthaginian towns, and had kindled into a mighty blaze the flame of discontent which was always smouldering among the African subjects of the imperial city, that he returned to Sicily to carry fire and sword into other regions from which their Greek blood might have been expected to protect them. The havoc which Agathocles had wrought in Africa might be repaired, and was soon repaired by the wealth and energy of the Carthaginians. But there was something which no efforts of theirs could now undo. By his invasion of Africa, Agathocles had shown the way in which Carthage could be best assailed. He had probed the weakness of the Carthaginian empire to the very bottom, and mightier men than he and a mightier people than the Greeks of Sicily were all too soon to follow in his footsteps. Okay. Chapter 3, Carthage and Rome. Rome and Carthage compared, contrasted. Origin and growth of Rome, constitutional progress, military progress, conquest of Etruscans, Gauls, of Latins, BC 390, of Samnites, Roman methods in war, war with Pyrrhus, Rome brought face to face with Carthage. It is time now to take a glance at the origin and rise of the younger city on the banks of the Tiber, whose progress towards the dominion of the world, Carthage and Carthage alone of the states of antiquity, was able seriously to delay. The history of Rome is like and yet unlike that of Carthage. It is like it, for we see in each the growth of a civic community which, from very small beginnings under an aristocratic form of government and with slight literary or artistic tastes, acquired first by the force of circumstances the leadership of the adjoining cities which were akin to her in blood, and subsequently by a far-sighted policy or by a strong arm became mistress not only of them but by their aid of all the tribes whom nature had not cut off from them by the sea, the mountains, or the desert. But Roman history is intrinsically unlike the Carthaginian, for the greatness of Rome rested not, as did the greatness of Carthage, on her wealth, or her commerce, or her colonies, or her narrow oligarchy, but on the constitutional progress which, after a long struggle, obliterated the mischievous privileges of an aristocracy of birth and raised the commonalty to a complete social and political equality with their former lords. It rested on the grand moral qualities which formed the groundwork of the Roman character in its best times: earnestness and simplicity of life, reverence for the sanctities of the family relations, reverence for the law, reverence for the gods. It rested on the extraordinary concentration of all these qualities, together with the soundest practical ability which the state contained in the Senate, perhaps when taken at its best, the noblest deliberative assembly which the world has ever seen. And when the two orders in the state had become united and Rome was fairly launched in her career as a conquering power, her greatness rested, how unlike to Carthage, on the real community of interest and of blood which united her to the greater number of the Italian tribes that she absorbed, on the self sacrifice which bade her then and for a long time to come tax not her subjects but herself, on the wise precautions which she took to secure their permanent allegiance, partly by isolating them from one another, partly by leaving them in some sense to govern themselves, or by admitting them to a share, actual or prospective, in the Roman citizenship. The district, originally occupied by the Latin race, which achieved such grand results, was a small tract of land not larger than an English county, which lay between the Tiber and the Arno, on the north and the Alban Hills on the south, and the future capital of the world was originally only one of 30 small settlements, of which she was the first neither in antiquity nor in strength nor in natural advantages. Alba and Lanuvium were older, Tusculum was stronger, Tiber and Praeneste were more fruitful and more salubrious than Rome. What circumstances enabled Rome, built as she was on one of the least healthy and least fertile spots occupied by the Latin League, so soon to obtain a preeminent position among them, we need not here inquire. The Roma Quadrata on the Palatine Hill soon grew into Rome of the Seven Hills. She encouraged migration to herself from the adjoining cities of the League, the manumission of slaves, and the growth of commerce and agriculture soon gave her a dependent population which formed the origin of the plebeians. And when the venerable Alba fell before the arms of Rome, Rome naturally succeeded by the right of the worthiest as well as by the right of the strongest to all her privileges and dignities as president of the Latin League. It belongs not to our purpose here to trace the vicissitudes of the long and eventful struggle between the privileged patricians and the unenfranchised plebes, to show in detail how the social grievances of the lower orders, their exclusion from all share in the public land for which they had shed their blood, the caste jealousy which forbade a patrician to intermarry with one of a less sacred race, the atrocious law of debtor and creditor gave way one after the other in spite of the armed opposition and the prejudices and the subterfuges of those patricians who, as they alone profited by existing abuses, naturally enough clubbed together to resist reform. Nor need we relate at length how these same plebeians, by the heroism of their natural leaders or their secessions to the sacred mount, first obtained inviolable magistrates of their own, the tribunes of the plebes, with powers so extraordinary that if the Roman people had not been the most law abiding people in the world, all public business must have come to a standstill. How the right of appeal from the arbitrary sentences of the magistrate to the people assembled in their comitia was again and again confirmed, even as Magna Carta was again and again confirmed by English kings, each fresh ratification rendering, no doubt, the sanction more impressive and using the word people in a more comprehensive and a truer sense, how office after office and dignity after dignity, the quaestorship and military tribunate, the consulship and the senate itself were thrown open to the plebeians, first in theory and afterwards in fact, how the Licinian rogations, after 9 years of party warfare, ceased to be rogations and became laws, and how finally Camillus, the chief of the old aristocracy, crowned the political edifice by what perhaps rightly considered is the greatest event in the internal history of Rome, the dedication of the famous Temple of Concord in BC 367. It is incumbent on the student of the history of Carthage not so much to analyze the process as to note the result of this long constitutional conflict. And that grand result was that the two orders became indissolubly united, socially and politically, into one nation, and were thus prepared, whether for good or for evil, to assert their natural supremacy over the rest of Italy and then to conquer the world. Nor again does it fall within the scope of this work to follow with any degree of minuteness the early progress of the Roman arms. It must suffice to trace only so much of its outline as may enable us to judge of the true position of the conquering city when a wider field opened before her and she had to face no longer the petty warfare of bordering townships, nor even the collective strength of Samnite and Etruscan confederations, but Carthage, Macedon, and the East. The expulsion of the kings in BC 509 left Rome still a prey to internal discord, a circumstance of which her nearest neighbors, the Etruscans, wholly alien as they were to her in race, were not slow to avail themselves. The Etruscan nation, with its gloomy and mysterious religion, the solemn trifling of its augural signs, and the cruelty of its gladiatorial games was just then at the height of its power by land and sea. Now was its opportunity, and the fond but soul stirring romances of the ballad singers and analysts of early Rome have not been able wholly to disguise the fact that the city itself fell before the arms of Porsena. But the triumph of Etruria was not long lived. A protracted warfare of 150 years succeeded, in which the star of Rome came gradually into the ascendant, and the fall of Veii after a 10-year siege, and still more perhaps the hurricane of northern barbarians, which just then burst over the fairest plains of Italy, set Rome forever free from danger on the side of Etruria. But Rome was delivered from the Etruscans only in BC 390 to find that the Gaul was thundering at her gates. The city was burned to the ground, her temples desecrated, her historical records destroyed, her inhabitants dispersed or slain. But no such ephemeral calamity could shatter the traditions or shake the resolution of the Roman people. Rome rose like the phoenix from her ashes and started afresh on her career of conquest. Her ancient enemies, the Equians and Volscians, who, according to the patriotic narrative of Livy, had for so many years in the early history of the Republic been annually exterminated and had annually revived to be exterminated again, had long since died their last death as independent nations. The Etruscans were now powerless. The last desperate effort of the Latins to restore when it was too late. In BC 340 to 338, the equality of their ancient league was crushed in two campaigns, and Rome now found herself face to face with the worthiest antagonist she had yet met, the brave and hardy Sabellian race, which was akin to herself in blood, which had lately almost annexed Campania, and which clung with desperate tenacity and with manners that never changed to the rugged and mountains and the inaccessible defiles of the central and southern Apennines. The struggle is memorable for the deeds of heroism which mark its course on either side, for the stubborn resistance and chivalrous bravery of the weaker, and on more than one occasion for the perfidy and the meanness of the stronger combatant. But it is yet more remarkable in the eye of him who would read the story of the Punic farce aright, for the light it throws upon the true secret of the Roman strength in war. Never did the iron resolution and devotion of her citizens, never did the unbending consistency of purpose and the marvelous self restraint of the Senate display itself more brilliantly, without haste but without a pause, never elated by victory, never depressed by defeat, not caring to overrun what they could not hold by force of arms or to obtain by treaty what they could not take without it, willing to employ years instead of months and to conquer by inches where they might have conquered by leagues, the Roman Senate, slow but sure, held on the even tenor of their course, determined only that where the Roman eagles had once set down their talons, there they should remain till the time came to plunge them more deeply into the vitals of the foe. Did Samnium, at the close of the great 22-year struggle, lie, to all appearance, prostrate at the feet of Rome, the last of her fortresses, Bovianum, in the grasp of the conqueror? That conqueror concluded an equitable peace on terms of all but equal alliance, not because she liked to spare the conquered. That maxim is to be found only in the patriotic imagination of the author of the Aeneid, but simply because she did not choose to be brought face to face with southern Italy before she had made quite sure of central. To build a new fortress, to found a new military colony, to complete a stage or two more of a great military road, if only it could better secure what lay behind and give a vantage ground for future operations whenever the time should come. This was the strictly practical object of Rome when she took up arms. This she kept in view when smarting under a defeat. And what is more remarkable, with this she rested content even when flushed with victory. In this way, always aiming only at what was feasible, making sure of every inch of her way, drawing her iron network of colonies and military roads over every district which she professed to claim. Rome found herself at length in BC 293 with not a single danger behind her and with nothing in front save some luxurious Greek cities and some insignificant tribes of Italian aborigines to separate her from that which was at once the object of her highest hopes and of her most practical and stern resolves, the union of the whole of Italy beneath her sway. We have said that there was but one obstacle to the realization of the aim of Rome, but one other there shortly appeared, which, as it had been beyond the visible, so was it necessarily beyond the mental horizon of so matter of fact a body as the Roman Senate. The adventurous king of Epirus, whose erratic course it would have required a genius like his own to have anticipated, shot down like a meteor on the scene in BC 280. Fired with the ambition of emulating his great relative Alexander and of founding a vast Greek empire in the west on the ruins of Italy and Carthage, as Alexander had founded his on the ruins of Persia and of Egypt, he eagerly seized the opportunity afforded him by the appeal of the frivolous Tarentines and offered to lead the Greek cities of Italy in their opposition to Rome. The struggle is rich above most of those in which Rome engaged in the play of individual character and in the traits of knightly chivalry and generosity, which lend to it a charm which is altogether its own. Even his sober minded and severely practical enemies could scarcely come into contact with so high bred and chivalrous a foe as Pyrrhus without catching some sparks of his courtesy and his enthusiasm. But the struggle is also memorable as the first occasion in which Greece and Rome met in the shock of battle. Here, for the first time, might be seen the Roman legion meeting the phalanx of Macedon, a national militia arrayed against highly trained and veteran mercenaries, individual military genius against collective mediocrity. For a moment, fortune seemed to waver or even to incline in favor of the adventurer. But she could not waver long. The victories of Heraclea and Asculum must have made the name of Pyrrhus a name to be spoken with bated breath even in the Roman Senate. And the lightning rapidity with which he swept Sicily from end to end, cooping the Mamertines in Messana on the extreme west and the Phoenicians in Lilybaeum in the extreme east, must have made his name a name of terror even among the burghers of Carthage. But the proud answer returned by the Roman Senate to the embassy of Pyrrhus after his first victory, that Rome never negotiated so long as an enemy was on Italian soil, must have at once opened the eyes of the Epirot king to the hopeless nature of the enterprise he had undertaken and marked triumphantly the goal to which centuries of tempered aspiration and of impetuous resolve had raised the Latin city. To the Roman mind, an ideal which could not be realized was no ideal at all, and the Romans had now realized their highest ideal to an extent which entitled them to take a wholly new point of departure. That's in BC 278. Pyrrhus disappeared from the Western world almost as rapidly as he had descended on it, crying with his last breath, half in pity, half in envy, how fair a battlefield are we leaving to the Romans and Carthaginians? He spoke too truly. The arena was already cleared of its lesser combatants, and for some few years there was, as it were, the hush of expectation, the audible silence of suspense, while mightier combatants were arming for the fray, and the great duel was preparing, of which 100 years would hardly see the termination. Chapter 4. First Punic War. I think. First Punic War. Messana and Agrigentum. BC 264 to 262. Relations of Sicily to Carthage and Rome. Appeal of Mamertines for aid. The question at issue. Importance of the decision. Romans occupy Messana. They attack Syracuse. Results of first campaign. Romans ally themselves with Hiero. Carthaginians unprepared for war. Agrigentum. Its siege. Its fate. It is not the least striking testimony to the sense of relief with which the nations of the West must have seen Pyrrhus return to his own country that the Romans and Carthaginians, in the face of so redoubtable a foe, had agreed to forget their mutual jealousies till such time as he should transfer himself and his ambitious schemes to another quarter of the globe. The second victory of Pyrrhus over the Romans had been followed by the appearance of a Carthaginian fleet off the mouth of the Tiber, offering to the Roman Senate their aid against him. The offer was at first declined, but shortly afterwards a close alliance was concluded, and the Carthaginian fleet, which had in vain attempted to intercept Pyrrhus on his crossing into Sicily, inflicted a heavy loss upon him as he hastily retreated from it. But hardly had Pyrrhus turned his back for the last time on Italy when the first note of war between the nations so recently allied was sounded. It came, as was to be expected, from that fair island which, by its position, seemed to belong half to Europe, half to Africa, and from that point in it which lay actually within sight of Rhegium, the town which was as yet the farthest outpost of the Roman alliance. For more than a century past, Greeks and Carthaginians had been contending with varying success for the possession of the island. Few towns of any importance within its limits had escaped destruction, fewer still had escaped a siege, and many had been taken and retaken almost as many times as there had been campaigns. On the whole, in spite of the efforts of able leaders like Dionysius the Tyrant, Timoleon, and Agathocles, fortune had favored the Carthaginians, and the power of Syracuse, the head of the Greek states, was now confined to the southeast corner of the island. But there was one town in the island, and that an all important one from its geographical position, which had by a strange destiny ceased to be Greek without becoming Carthaginian, and after outraging Greek and Carthaginian alike and arousing their active hostility, had now, to make matters better, appealed for aid to a third power which was destined to prove mightier than either. When Agathocles, tyrant of Syracuse, died in BC 289, his mercenary troops were disbanded, and a body of them, on their way back to Campania, the native country, treacherously seized Messana, which had entertained them hospitably. They expelled or slew the male inhabitants, divided their wives and children, and calling themselves the children of Mammers or Mars, proceeded to justify their name by plundering or harrying all the surrounding country. Such outrages could not be overlooked by the Carthaginians. Still less could they pass unnoticed by the young king Hiero, who had lately obtained the vacant throne of Syracuse by the best of titles, the free choice alike of his comrades in arms and of his fellow citizens. And he proceeded to lay siege to the town. The Mamertine councils were divided. It was clear that without allies they would not long hold out against the powerful foes whose deadly hostility they had provoked. One party among them was for surrendering the place to the Carthaginians to keep out the Syracusans. The other was for invoking the Romans to keep out both alike. Never was a question fraught with more important issues, moral and political, brought before the Roman Senate, and never did they shirk their responsibility more shamefully. It is not perhaps so easy to see what was the right thing to do as it is to see that what the Roman Senate did was the very worst thing that they could do. Were they, on the one hand, to refuse to protect Italians who appealed to them avowedly as the head of the Italian Confederation for aid against the Greeks and Carthaginians, and to look calmly on while the city of Messana fell into the hands of the Carthaginians, to be used by them as a standing menace to their power and a vantage ground in the great conflict which could not now be far distant? Or were they, on the other hand, to lull their consciences to sleep, to turn round upon Hero, their ally who had recently lent them his aid in getting rid of the lawless banditti who had seized Regium as the Mamertines had seized Messana, and to take under their special protection a band of cutthroats on one side of the straits, while they had just scourged and beheaded every member of a similar and perhaps a less guilty band on the other? It was a question beset with difficulties. National honor and common gratitude pointed clearly in one direction. Ambition and immediate interest pointed as clearly in another, and the Roman Senate took the most ignoble course of all open to it, that of shifting the responsibility from their own shoulders to that of the people assembled in their comitia. The consuls Appius Claudius Caudax and M. Fulvius Flaccus were ambitious men eager for war at any price. It was easy for them to raise a patriotic cry of Italians against foreigners and to hold out visions of assignations of public land amongst the grey rich fields of Sicily to the multitude whose appetite for such booty had been recently whetted by the large distributions of land in Italy. The decision of the people was not doubtful, and the most momentous resolution ever arrived at by the Romans was taken without either the definite sanction or the explicit disapproval of the Senate. This was in BC 264. It was possible for the Senate, perhaps by such paltry conduct, to deprive themselves of some of the credit which might ultimately be won by the war. It was not possible to relieve themselves of the shame of its commencement. Nor was the step now taken less serious from a political than from a moral point of view, for, in truth, upon the passing of the narrow arm of sea which rages between Italy and Sicily hinged the future destinies of both countries, and not of these alone, but of the ancient civilized world. Hitherto, the policy of the Roman Senate had been definite and strictly practical, and had not carried them beyond the horizon of Italy proper. If they had owned ships of war at all, they had been of a small size and built upon an antique model. Now, for the first time, they were about to set foot beyond the seas to embark upon a policy, the course of which it would no longer rest with them to determine. To claim, without ships of their own, from the greatest of naval powers, a portion of the island which had for centuries been looked upon as her peculiar appanage. Some clear sighted men there must have been among the Roman senators who recoiled from the results of what they had done, or rather from the results of what they had refrained through moral cowardice from doing. But their voices were not heard, and active operations began. War, indeed, against Carthage was not formally declared, for the diplomatists of either nation had yet to go through the solemn farce which usually precedes such a declaration by raking up forgotten grievances or inventing new ones to justify the resolution which had been already taken. But orders were given at once to relieve Messana. The command was committed to Appius Claudius in BC 264, more easy work being found for his colleague Flaccus nearer home. The want of ships of war and even of transports, for by a strange short sightedness, the Romans had allowed such ships as they had to fall into decay at the very time when they most needed them, was met by borrowing them from the Greek cities of Italy, Tarentum, Locri, Velia, and Neapolis. But a more serious difficulty occurred when Claudius, the legatee of the councils and forerunner of the Roman army, appeared at Rhegium. Things had taken an unexpected turn at Messana. The party favorable to Carthage had got the upper hand, and the Carthaginian fleet was riding at anchor in the harbor, while a Carthaginian garrison was in possession of the citadel. Here was an awkward predicament for the Romans. But C. Claudius was, like most of his family, a man of energy and audacity. He crossed the straits at the peril of his life, invited the Admiral Hanno to a conference, and then, in defiance of the law of nations and of honor, took him prisoner and allowed him to purchase his liberty and life only by the surrender of the citadel. Hanno's life was not worth the price he paid for it, for the Carthaginians, enraged at his cowardice and incapacity, condemned him to be crucified, a punishment which was not very exceptional in their administration of justice, but was certainly not always so well deserved. The Mamertines, who were equally ready to follow anyone who seemed able to promise them the lives which by their crimes they had so justly forfeited, were now besieged in Messana from the north side of the city by a second Hanno, whom the Carthaginians had sent out to replace the first, while Hiero attacked it from the south. Such was the condition of affairs when Appius Claudius himself appeared with his army upon the scene. How he managed to cross the straits with 20,000 men in the face of an enemy whose proud boast it was that without their leave no Roman could even bathe his hands in the sea, we do not know. But cross them he did, and by a double victory on two successive days, first over Hiero and then over the Carthaginians, he succeeded in raising the siege and, after ravaging the country in every direction, pitched his camp under the walls of Syracuse and prepared to besiege Hiero in his own capital. But 200 years of internecine warfare with the Carthaginians had not predisposed the Syracusans to take any very strong measures in defense of their temporary alliance with them. Appius suffered, as had so often been the case in previous sieges of Syracuse, far more from the malaria of the marshes of the Anapus than from any active hostility of Hiero. And when the Romans thought fit to retreat towards Messana from so unhealthy a region and were followed closely by the Syracusans, Hiero found that the troops of the rival armies were more disposed to meet in friendly gatherings at the outposts than in hostile array in the battlefield. So ended the first campaign. With one small army, the Romans had already attained the ostensible objects of the war. The Mamertines had been relieved, the protectorate of Rome over them asserted, much booty had been gained, the Carthaginians had been driven back towards the northwest, and the Syracusans towards the southeast of the island. Why did not Rome stop here? Why was she not content to rest upon her laurels and to retain in her own hands or in those of the Mamertines, who were now devoted to her interests, the immediate state of Messana, which would henceforward serve as a buffer against any hostile designs of the Carthaginians? Could the Romans have foreseen the heavy reverses and the Cadmean victories of the 23 years' war, which was to drag out its tedious length after so brilliant a beginning, they might well have hesitated to purchase at so heavy a price an island which, by the time it came into their hands, would be hardly in itself worth possessing. But once more, the horizon of the Senate had expanded with their achievements, and no longer content with securing the corner of Sicily nearest to themselves, they had conceived the design of stripping Carthage and Syracuse alike of so much of their Sicilian possessions as would render them forever innocuous neighbors. Where one small army had achieved so much in the face of every obstacle, physical and moral, what might not two consular armies accomplish, especially when supported by powerful allies in the island itself, whose fidelity was secured by the strongest of securities? The second campaign was not less successful than the first. There was now no rumor of disturbance in the neighborhood of Rome, and the two consuls, M. Octacilius and M. Valerius, were able to cross together into Sicily with their united armies amounting to 35,000 men. They met with no serious resistance. 50, or as others said, 67 towns belonging to Hiero or the Carthaginians submitted to them, and Hiero himself, consulting partly, no doubt, the wishes of his subjects, partly his own feelings of hatred towards the hereditary oppressors of his country, turned from the setting to the rising sun and made overtures of peace to Rome. The Romans were keenly alive to the advantages which an alliance with Syracuse would bring them while they were waging war in the interior of the island. Their supplies, the point in which they were most deficient, would be secured by the immediate neighborhood of so opulent a friend. But the Senate thought fit to assume the air of those who were conferring a favor and managed to drive a hard bargain with the Syracusan king. Perhaps a power which was in the full tide of success could hardly have been expected to act otherwise. Hero was compelled to pay a war contribution of 200 talents and to surrender several of his towns, and he became henceforward to the end of his long life and reign to all appearance the grateful and certainly the faithful and the trusted ally of Rome. Under his wise and beneficent rule, Syracuse, though war was surging around her by land and sea, enjoyed a degree of prosperity and of internal quiet to which, with the one exception of the time of Timoleon, it may perhaps be said she had been a stranger for 2 centuries before, and which she has never enjoyed since. But where were the Carthaginians all this time? 2 campaigns had been fought and won, and they had nowhere yet shown themselves in force. They had allowed themselves, with hardly a struggle, to be swept from the larger half of the island. Would they allow themselves to be swept without resistance from the remainder? The truth is that they were neither inactive nor cowardly. They were simply, owing to the defects of their military system, unprepared. And they were all this time straining every nerve to raise a force in Africa, in Liguria, in Spain, and in Gaul, which they hoped might eventually be able to strike a vigorous blow and to retrieve their fortunes. About halfway between the promontories of Libybium and Pachinus, and drawn back a mile or so from the southern coast, was the important city of Agrigentum. It had once boasted a population of 2 lakh souls, a fact to which the size and extent of its majestic ruins still bear witness. And though its ruthless destruction by the Carthaginians in BC 405, which has already been described, and the misgovernment of domestic tyrants had shorn it of much of its grandeur and prosperity, it had been refounded by Timoleon and was still at the time of the First Punic War the second Greek city in Sicily, and was able to give shelter to a garrison of 50,000 men. Here Hannibal, son of Gisco, concentrated the forces which had been gathered from such distant countries. Here he determined to make a stand in the field and behind its bulwarks. After collecting vast stores of provisions and of materials for war, he was prepared, if need be, to stand a siege. Hither also came all the forces which the Roman Senate thought necessary to deal with a foe who during 2 campaigns had seemed anxious only to keep himself out of sight. A small army, so it is said, of 2 legions only. That this army, however, was on second thoughts judged to be too small and was doubled in size is clear from the fact that both consuls are mentioned as having taken part in the siege, and doubtless the Mamertines and Syracusans made the total much larger still. The consuls of the year were L. Postumius and Q. Mamilius, BC 262. They pitched their camp 8 stadia from the town and imprudently sent out their troops in large numbers to forage in the surrounding country. Hannibal seized the opportunity, and only the heroism of some Roman pickets who, to allow time for the foragers to get back into the camp, died to a man fighting bravely at their posts, saved the Romans from disaster. It is not the only occasion in this war which proves that the far-famed sentry of Pompey, who preferred, with visor down, to be overwhelmed by the lava torrent at his post, rather than leave it with the flying citizens, was no isolated or exceptional example of Roman heroism. He only acted as every Roman was brought up to act as a matter of course, and as few ever failed to act when the emergency arrived. Both sides now displayed greater caution. The Carthaginians contented themselves with harassing the Romans with missiles from a distance, while the Romans broke up their army into 2 separate camps connected by a double line of entrenchments, the one to protect them against the sallies of the besieged, the other to guard against possible dangers from the rear. The town of Arbeces, a few miles to the north, supplied them with abundant provisions and seemed to remove famine, at all events, from the list of contingencies to which they might be exposed. In this state of things, 5 months passed away, and to all appearance, the siege was no nearer a successful termination than at the beginning. But provisions had begun to fail in the closely packed quarters of the defenders, and in deference to the urgent solicitations of Hannibal, Hanno was sent to Sicily with a new army and with orders, if possible, to compel the Romans to raise the siege. Making Heraclea his headquarters, Hanno managed to surprise Arbaces and so cut off the supplies of the enemy. The Romans now found themselves in the position of besieged rather than besiegers. Pestilence was Pestilence as well as famine was at work in their lines, and it was the extraordinary energy of Hero in supplying them with provisions when Arbaces fell, which alone prevented them from giving up the enterprise in despair. Decisive operations could not now be long delayed. In a preliminary engagement, the Roman horse experienced for the first time the superiority of the famous Numidian light cavalry. But in the battle which ensued, the motley Carthaginian infantry found that they were as yet no match for the soldiers of the legion. 50 elephants, wild beasts, Polybius, with an air of horror, still calls them, fought on the side of the Carthaginians, a number many times as great as that which a few years before, in the time of Pyrrhus, had carried dismay and confusion into the Roman ranks. But on this occasion, as often afterwards, elephants were found to be a two-edged weapon which might be fatal to the hand that wielded it. 30 of the 50 were killed, and 11 remained alive in the hands of the Romans as vast moving trophies of the victory that had been won. Hanno saved a remnant of his army by his hasty flight to Heraclea, and Hannibal, whom the Romans looked upon as already within their grasp, sheltered by the darkness of a winter's night and helped by the energy of despair, made a last effort to break through the lines of his victorious foe. The Romans, overcome with fatigue or giving the reins to their joy, had relaxed their vigilance. With bags stuffed with straw, Hannibal filled up the deep trenches, scaled the ramparts, and managed with the effective part of his army to pass through the Roman lines unobserved. In the morning, the enemy, discovering what had happened, went through the form of pursuing the retreating Hannibal. But they were more eager to fall on the unhappy town which he had abandoned to their mercy. The inhabitants surrendered at discretion, but they had to undergo all the horrors of a place taken by storm. The town was given up to plunder, and 25,000 freemen were sold into slavery. Nothing throughout the whole of Sicily now remained in the hands of the Carthaginians, save a few fortresses on its western coasts. And this was the precise moment at which, according to the explicit statement of Polybius, it first dawned upon the Romans that they had embarked upon a war, the true and only object of which must be to eject the Carthaginians altogether from the island. Chapter 5. First Roman Fleet. Battles of Mylae and Ecnomus. Carthaginian naval supremacy. Roman naval affairs. Commercial treaties with Carthage. Difficulties of Romans. Want of ships of war. Want of sailors. The new fleet. Its first ventures. Naval science and tactics of the ancients. The Corvus. Battle of Mylae. Horns paid to Dullius. Egesta. The Romans attack Sardinia and Corsica. Energy of Carthaginians. Romans resolved to invade Africa. Enormous naval armaments. Route taken by the Romans. Order of battle. Battle of Ecnomus. If the resolution now come to by Rome was to be carried out, it was clear that a complete change in the conduct of the war would be necessary. The Carthaginians had at length begun to put forth their real strength and to assert the supremacy over the seas which had, in fact, never ceased to belong to them. With a fleet of 60 ships, they coasted round Sicily and by sheer terror, without striking a blow, brought back to their allegiance many towns which had gone over to Rome. The Romans might retain their grip on the interior of the island, but the coasts, it was clear, would belong to Carthage so long as she remained mistress of the seas. Nor was this all. By making frequent descents at distant points on the Italian coast, the Carthaginian fleet kept the inhabitants of the seaboard in a state of constant alarm, which it was quite beyond the power of any land forces raised by the Italians themselves to allay. For by the nature of the case, the Carthaginians, choosing, like the Northmen centuries afterwards, their own place and time, were able to destroy a town or to harry a district before alarm could be given to the nearest military station. It was apparent that the war might go on forever, each of the combatants being able to annoy and injure, but not to paralyze or destroy the other, unless something should occur to change the conditions under which it was being carried on. The Carthaginians wanted only what they had not yet succeeded in finding, a first-rate general to enable them to make a descent in force in Italy and so make Rome tremble for her own safety. The Romans wanted only an efficient fleet to enable them to meet Carthage on her own element and then to transfer the contest to Africa. The all important question was which would be found first. A life and death struggle generally finds out and brings to the front, in spite of all artificial obstacles, a true military genius, even amongst a people whose collective genius is not military. But it has very rarely been known to change the whole character of a people at once, to transform landlubbers into seamen, and what is more extraordinary still, to enable them to cope on equal terms with the greatest naval power of the time. The chances, therefore, were so far not in favor of Rome. But we must beware of indulging in the exaggerations in which it was natural enough for Polybius and other historians of the time to indulge in their admiration of the energy of Rome. What the Romans did was wonderful enough without the addition of a single fictitious detail to make it more so. It may be true, as Polybius says, that at the outbreak of the war, Rome had no decked ships, no ships of war, no, not even a limbus, a small ship's boat with a sharp prow which they could call their own. But that the Romans were not so wholly ignorant of naval affairs as the ludicrous picture of 100 batches of would-be sailors training themselves to row on the sand from scaffolds would at first suggest is clear from the fact that Rome had, in the early days of the Republic, fitted out ships with 3 banks of oars to keep in order piratical neighbors like the Antiochs or the Etruscans. That there were magistrates called Dumviri navales who from time to time were appointed for the express purpose of repairing the fleet, and that the Carthaginians themselves had thought it worth their while repeatedly to form a commercial treaty with the Romans, restricting carefully their mutual rights and duties. The Romans and their allies shall not sail beyond the south of the fair promontory, that is, the well known Hermaean promontory to the northeast of Carthage, unless compelled by stress of weather or an enemy. And if so compelled, they shall not take or purchase anything except what is barely necessary for refitting their vessels or for sacrifice, and in any case, they shall depart within 5 days. So runs one of the articles of the commercial treaty made, it is said, while Rome was as yet hardly the undisputed head of the Latin League in BC 409, hardly a year after the expulsion of the kings. And a second treaty concluded according to Polybius 131 years later in BC 348, shortly after the passing of the Licinian rogations, contains similar but still more jealous stipulations. In it, the Roman vessels are precluded, and the mere fact of the prohibition is a proof of the extent of Roman maritime enterprise, not only from the rich emporia on the Lesser Syrtis, but from the navigation of the Atlantic and from all commercial dealings with the subjects of Carthage in Africa and Sardinia. Still, the Romans had never been a really maritime or commercial people. They did not love the sea, much less had they been a naval power. And how were they to become so all at once? The question was beset with difficulties. Triremes, no doubt, they might borrow from the Greek cities of Italy as they had done once before, but these would no more face the bulky monsters called quinqueremes, which now formed the Carthaginian ships of the line, than an English revenue cutter could board a frigate. The Romans must have felt all the needs upon a vaster scale, which dawned upon a people as land loving and as exclusive as themselves, when the conquest of Asian Geber opened to the untraveled Israelites the navigation of the Red Sea and the unknown possibilities of the East beyond it. But to the Hebrew subjects of King Solomon, a way out of the difficulty was open, which was not available to the Romans now. The gold of Solomon was able to procure Phoenician shipwrights who could construct, and Phoenician mariners who could navigate and steer his vessels among the dangerous waters of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The descendants of these selfsame Phoenicians, the heirs of their traditions and of a double portion of their maritime genius, were the deadly enemies of Rome, and the Roman landsmen must face the dangers of the sea, not with their aid but against their most strenuous opposition. Again, the quinquereme was not merely twice as large as a trireme, but was of a different build and construction. It was necessary, therefore, to obtain either shipwrights or a model from some nation to which such moving castles had been long familiar. There were ships of the line long enough, no doubt, in the fleet of the Macedonians, their original inventors, or in that of the Egyptians. But to procure shipwrights or a model of a quinquereme from them would be difficult in time of war and would involve a serious and perhaps a dangerous delay. Here, chance was on the side of the Romans. A Carthaginian quinquereme had run ashore on the coast of Bruttium 2 or 3 years before and had fallen into the hands of the Romans. This served as the wished for model, and it is asserted by more than one writer that within 60 days a growing wood was felled and transformed into a fleet of 100 ships of the line and 20 triremes. The next difficulty was to find men for the fleet, and when they had found them, to train them for their duties. How the large number of 30,000 rowers necessary to propel the ships and of 12,000 marines necessary to fight on board of them were raised in so short a time from a people that was not a seafaring people, we have no precise information. But as soon as they had been got together, and while the building of the ship was still in progress, they went, if we may believe the well known story, through a course of training for the most important of their functions, that of rowing in time at the voice of the Caliostus, by taking their seats on tiers of stages, and by making believe to go through the various evolutions which would be expected of them. Probably never did a fleet set sail under greater difficulties of every kind than this. The starting timbers of the unseasoned wood of which the ships were built, and the distressing maladies which would assuredly befall a herd of landsmen who had gone through only the mechanical preparation for the sea which we have described, might well have made men doubt whether either ships or crews would ever live to experience the shock of the Carthaginian battle. But we hear nothing of this. Perhaps, after all, the ships were manned in part not by Romans but by Greek and Etruscan mariners, and we know only that hardly were the ships launched when they fearlessly set sail in BC 261. Monsieur Cornelius Scipio went forward with the vanguard of 17 vessels, leaving the other consul, M. Duilius, behind to superintend the equipment of the main body of the fleet and afterwards to take the command of the army. He reached Messana in safety, but a message from Lipara, the largest of the group of islands of that name to the northeast of Sicily, which belonged to Carthage, induced him to cross over to receive, as he thought, its submission. He had no sooner entered the harbor than he found his retreat cut off by 20 Carthaginian vessels, which had been sent for that purpose by Hannibal, the admiral at Panormus. The crews were seized with a sudden panic and with true landsman's instincts made for the friendly shore which was close at hand. Cornelius, who earned for himself the name of Asina by the ease with which he had fallen into the trap which had been laid for him, stuck gallantly to his post and was taken prisoner together with the empty vessels of his feet. This was not a promising beginning for the Romans, but imprudence and incapacity were not confined to them. The Carthaginian admiral, elated by his success, determined to intercept the whole Italian fleet as it sailed down the coast towards Messana. He fell unexpectedly into their midst when his ships were in disorder, and he himself escaped with difficulty, leaving the greater number of his vessels in the hands of the enemy. The Carthaginians had been disposed at first to laugh at the idea of the Romans venturing to face them in their own element. And though the laugh had now, for the moment at all events, been turned against themselves, the Romans were much too clear sighted not to see that it was chance and the imprudence of the enemy which had been their best ally in this first engagement, and that the Carthaginians, having been caught napping once, would be sure to be more wide awake in the future. Dr. Arnold remarks that the naval service of the ancients generally was, out of all proportion, inferior to their land service. The seamen were of a lower class. The ships were propelled in battle by oars alone. Engines for the discharge of missiles were unknown or unused, and the charge with the beak was the only recognized method of attack. The remark is a just one, and it applies in its measure to the nations which were foremost as well as to those which were more backward in naval affairs. But the skill in naval warfare which the Carthaginians had acquired in centuries could not be learnt by Rome in a day. There are many points connected with the equipment and management of an ancient trireme which have not been cleared up, but it is certain from the nature of the case itself, as well as from the detailed account of the engagements in the Corinthian Gulf contained in the second book of Thucydides, that even for the simple maneuvers practiced by the ancients, the embole or charge on the side and the prosbole or charge beak to beak, the periplus and the diaplus, there was an incalculable difference between trained and untrained rowers. The Peloponnesian fleet, Phormyon told his men and told them truly, whatever its numbers could possibly contend against them with success. And his repeated victories showed that neither numbers nor personal valor nor discipline could be of any avail against the superior skill in maneuvering which the Athenians had attained during the 50 years that has passed since the fight at Salamis. It must also be borne in mind that the ancient rowers had often to contend in battle against wind and tide as well as against the foe. For the sails and masts were always cleared away as a preparation for action. And if the sea was running high, the utmost nicety in steering and the most perfect time and skill in rowing would be essential to the success of even the simplest maneuver. There was nothing but the voice of the Calliostros to keep the three tiers of rowers ranged one above the other with their oars of different weights and different lengths in time, and that voice would necessarily be drowned by the least excitement or confusion amongst the crews. If such careful training was found to be essential for the management of the trireme, what must it not have been for the quinquereme, a ship nearly twice the size with 5 banks of oars instead of 3? The immediate problem, therefore, for the Romans to solve was not how best to train their crews to charge with the beak, for no training would have fitted them for that before the engagement which was imminent, but how best to parry that charge and then to convert the naval into a land battle, leaving as little opportunity as possible for subsequent maneuvering and as much as possible for hand-to-hand conflict. The device which the Romans adopted to secure these ends was clumsy, but it was effectual. On the forepart of each vessel was erected an additional mast, and lashed to it by a powerful hinge at a height of 12 feet above the deck was a species of drawbridge, rising when it stood erect 24 feet above it. At the top of the mast was a pulley through which ran a rope connecting it with the higher end of the drawbridge. On the end of this last and standing out from it at right angles was a sharp spike of the strongest iron, which, from its resemblance when in its position to the bill of the raven, gave the name of corvus to the whole construction. When an enemy's vessel was seen approaching for the purpose either of charging directly beak to beak or of striking obliquely the tiers of oars, and so of incapacitating them for further use, the drawbridge, by an ingenious contrivance, could be swung round the mast towards the point where the danger threatened, and the moment the enemy came within reach, it could be let fall from its commanding height and with its heavy weight upon the deck of the attacking ship. The iron beak would pierce through the planking of the deck and hold it fast in a death grapple. The drawbridge was 4 feet broad and was furnished with parapets reaching as high as the knee. The Roman mariners could therefore descend along it two abreast in continuous columns, the foremost pair defending themselves completely by holding in front their oblong shields, while those who followed were protected in flank partly by the parapets and partly by their small round shields. In this way, in a very few moments from the time the Corvus fell, the whole body of the Roman mariners would find themselves on board the enemy's deck. The sea fight would be practically over and the land fight would begin, and the issue of this conflict between the mere rabble of the African crew and picked Roman legionaries could not be for a moment doubtful. Much ingenuity has been expended on the question of the purpose that could be served by fixing the lower end of the drawbridge so high up the mast and therefore so inconveniently high above the deck. But the explanation seems to lie in the fact which perhaps has escaped us because it was so obvious that the ships of both Romans and Carthaginians had bulwarks, and to enable the Corvus not merely to catch them as by a hook, but to penetrate the deck itself with its spike, it was necessary that the base of the drawbridge should be at a greater height than the bulwarks over which it would have to fall. A light ladder fixed on the side of the mast opposite to the Corvus, and doubtless revolving with it, would give easy access to the boarding bridge at the moment when it was required. Consul Duilius, hearing of the calamity that had befallen his patrician colleague at Lipara, left the control of the army, a matter as it seemed now of less moment to inferior officers, and assumed the far more critical post of admiral of the fleet. Finding that the enemy were engaged in ravaging Mylae, a peninsula and town on the northwest of the island, not far from Messana, he sailed fearlessly towards them. The Carthaginians, when with 130 well built and well manned ships, they saw the 100 ungainly Roman hulks, the timbers of which ought still to have been seasoning in the timber yard, and their landsmen, sailors, drawn from they knew not where, must have felt something of the thrill of long deferred delight which forced Napoleon from the exclamation, "At last I have them, those English, in my grasp," as assuredly they must have felt something of the keenness of his disappointment at the still more unlooked for result. Not caring in their confidence and joy even to form in line of battle, they bore down at once upon the Romans as on an easy prey. When they drew near, they were for the moment taken aback by the strange appearance of vessels coming into battle with their masts left standing. Masts, too, with such uncouth and extraordinary appendages attached to them. But their hesitation was only for a moment. Evidently, these raw enemies of theirs did not even know how to clear their decks for action. With redoubled confidence, 30 of the Carthaginian vessels charged beak to beak on as many of the Roman vessels, and each immediately found itself a prisoner, held fast by the grappling iron which had so excited their surprise and their contempt. Others of the Carthaginian ships, thinking to escape the fall of the drawbridge which had caught their comrades, charged sideways against other parts of the Roman ships, but round swung the fatal raven as though it were a thing of life, and descended upon them, pinning the vessels tight alongside of each other, and enabling the Roman legionaries to disperse with the bridge and to leap at once from every part of their vessel into that of the enemy. After 50 of their ships of war had been locked in this deadly embrace, the remainder, declining to fight at all with foes who were ill bred enough to fight and conquer against all the rules of naval warfare, took to flight. The admiral's ship, a monster heptarine, said formerly to have belonged to Pyrrhus of Epirus, was amongst those taken by the Romans, and the admiral Hannibal himself escaped in a little skiff by almost as narrow an escape as that by which, when general of the army, he had slipped through the Roman lines at the end of the siege of Agrigentum. The Romans were overjoyed, as well they might be, at their success. It was their first naval battle and their first great naval victory over the greatest naval power which the world has seen. Its importance was not to be measured by its immediate results, but rather by the omen it gave for the future. Honors, till then unexampled, were freely bestowed upon the plebeian Duilius. When he went out to supper, it was to the sound of music. When he returned home, it was with an escort of torch bearers. A pillar was erected to his honor in the forum called the Columna Rostrata, for it was adorned with the brazen beaks of the vessels which his wise ignorance and his clumsy skill had enabled him to capture. The great battle of Mylae was fought in the year BC 260, and the Roman army improved the victory of their fleet by at once marching to Augusta, a town which claimed relationship to Rome by reason of their supposed common descent from Troy, and which was situated in a part of Sicily considerably beyond any in which we have as yet seen the Romans. Augusta was always ready to ally itself with a foreigner. As we have already seen, it had called in the aid first of the Athenians and afterwards of the Carthaginians against its neighbor and rival Silenus, and now in the second year of the war it had attached itself to Rome. But the Carthaginians, eager to punish its defection, had straightway blockaded the place and were on the point of capturing it when the Romans arrived and forced them to raise the siege. The Roman fleet, too, now no longer confined its aims to the narrow Sicilian waters, but striking boldly across the open sea, threatened the empire of Carthage in the rich island of Sardinia also. In the savage mountains of the interior, the natives still managed to maintain something of their independence and of their barbarism. But the coasts had been for centuries in the possession of the Carthaginians. Thither, the unfortunate Hannibal, son of Gisco, had withdrawn shortly after his defeat at Mylae, thinking doubtless that there at least he would be safe from Roman molestation. But even there, the Romans, in the exultation of their first victory, pursued him. Pent within the harbor in which he had taken refuge, he lost several of his ships in an engagement, and on his escape to land was apprehended by his own men and crucified. They took the law into their own hands, but doubtless they only anticipated the sentence which would have been passed by the inexorable 100 on an unlucky admiral who should have returned to Carthage after surviving so many and such unprecedented reverses. The Romans followed up their success by an attack on Olbia, the capital of the island. The expedition failed, but an attempt upon Aleria, formerly a Phocian colony and now the capital of Corsica, was more successful. Corsica had probably never belonged outright to Carthage, but it had at least acknowledged her maritime supremacy, and the second treaty between Rome and Carthage seems to have recognized it as a kind of neutral territory between the two. The epitaph of L. Cornelius Scipio, which is still preserved, tells us how he took Corsica and Aleria, and how on his return to Rome he dedicated a well deserved temple to the tempest which had almost overwhelmed him in the Corsican waters. But the absence of the Roman fleet in Corsica and Sardinia proved a serious, if only a temporary, drawback to the progress of the Roman arms in Sicily. Rome could not yet afford so to dissipate her energy, and Hamilcar, commander in chief at Panormus, now gave evidence of a vigor and a capacity such as had hitherto not been witnessed among either of the contending parties. Hearing that the Romans and their allies, on their return from Augusta, were at discord among themselves, he surprised and cut to pieces 4,000 of the enemy in their camp near Himera. He destroyed the town of Eryx and transferred its inhabitants en masse to the neighboring fortress of Drepanum. And it was doubtless the bold front he showed which, in the following year, compelled the Romans to retire from before Panormus after merely convincing themselves of the strength of its fortifications. The other events of the 2 years which followed the Battle of Mylae, the alternate revolts and subjugations, the taking or retaking of such towns as Mytistratus, Enna, Gela, and Camarina, were not such, although the tide of success was on the whole in favor of the Romans, as to promise any speedy termination of the land war. While, as regards naval affairs, the Battle of Tyndaris, fought BC 237 on a spot only a few miles from Mylae, wherein each party claimed the victory, left things pretty much as they were. But the lull was only apparent, for both sides were straining every nerve to raise such a navy as should be able by sheer strength to bear down all opposition to it. The Romans, with the avowed intention of fighting their way into Africa and so compelling Carthage to submit to the terms of peace which they might be willing to offer her. The Carthaginians, with the hope of recovering the empire of the seas which had now been half torn from her, and of excluding the Romans, if not from the whole of her dependencies, at all events from her home domain in Africa. The material results in the way of shipping obtained by either side were not disproportionate to the efforts that had been made. Probably never, either before or after, did such vast naval armaments put to sea. The most important naval combats of ancient and modern times, the battles of Artemisium, Salamis, and Nalos, of Lepanto, Trafalgar, and Navarino, sink into insignificance as far as mere numbers go when compared with that of Ecnomus. Other battles doubtless enlist the sympathies more fully on one side or the other, or interest more keenly those who care for war merely as war. The stake fought for at Salamis was an infinitely higher stake and was fraught with vastly more momentous issues for the whole human race. For it was the cause of Greek freedom and civilization against Asiatic slavery and barbarism. At Trafalgar, the darling scheme of the heartless oppressor of all Europe was forever frustrated by the crowning naval victory of a war which the worst calumniators of England must admit was not a selfish war. In all these points, in the motives of the combatants, in its purely military or scientific interest, and in its results, the Battle of Ecnomus is not specially remarkable. It is impossible to give our undivided sympathies to either side. It was a battle in the main of brute force and not of consummate skill. It was not decisive even of the result of the war of which it formed so bulky a part. Still less can it attract those who look upon all wars except those waged in self defense or for purely moral ends. All wars, that is, except those waged ultimately in the interests of peace with horror and condemnation. Yet men are men, and even the Carthaginian mercenaries, though their employers did not think so, were worth something more than the pay they earned by their services. And size is size and will always, apart from everything else, and whether it ought to or not, attract to itself the attention of mankind. And from the view of and from the point of view of mere size, the number, that is, of its ships and the crews who fought in them, the Battle of Ecnomus is certainly entitled to a conspicuous place in history. At Artemisium, no doubt, the number of Greek and Persian vessels engaged or ready to be engaged must have been greater still, but they were triremes or pentacontas only. While at Ecnomus, the ships engaged were, in the main, quinqueremes or hexaremes, and the Roman fleet carried also a large army intended for land service in Africa. The vicissitudes of the battle are somewhat complicated, but it is necessary for one who would understand aright the first Punic War to dwell awhile upon a conflict which is so eminently characteristic of it. The Romans set sail from Messana in BC 256 with 330 ships, while the Carthaginians mustered the still more portentous number of 350 ships in their famous port of Lelabium. So that if we are to accept the deliberate calculation of Polybius, who assigns 300 rowers and 120 mariners to each ship of war, nearly 3 lakh men must have met in the battle which ensued. The direct line to Africa was along the northern coast of Sicily, but the strength of the Carthaginian virgin fortresses of Panormus, Drepanum, and Lilybaeum, all of which were on the north or northwest of the island, made the Romans prefer the southern coast, which was to a great extent in their own hands, and where their land army had assembled ready for embarkation. The Carthaginians, who knew too well what an invasion of Africa meant, and who felt that the ravages of the Roman army would not be the worst of the evils that it would involve, moved slowly forward to Heraclea Minova, determined to crush the invaders before they could leave the Sicilian coast. The Romans, having taken on board their legions at Phintias, divided their immense fleet into 4 squadrons. The 2 first squadrons formed 2 sides of an equilateral triangle, while the third, having behind them the transports laden with cavalry, formed its base. To the rear of these again, and forming at once a rear guard and a reserve, came the fourth squadron, which Polybius calls, from the important function allotted to it, the triarii. At the apex of the triangle, their prows standing out to sea and pointing the rest of the fleet the way to Africa, sailed abreast the two monster hexaremes, ships as large probably as our ships of the line of the consuls and admirals in one, Magistrate Attilius Regulus and L. Manlius. The whole Roman fleet together thus formed the figure called in nautical maneuvering an embolon or wedge, a figure said by Polybius to be suited to energetic action and very difficult to break through. On the other hand, is postulated a skill in seamanship and a confidence in their own powers both of attack and of defense, very different from that which marked the Roman fleet at their victory at Mylae only 3 years before. The Carthaginians, reminded by their admirals, Hanno, who had in vain attempted to raise the siege of Agrigentum, and Hamilcar, who had lately fought not without credit to himself at Tyndaris, of the momentous issues that were at stake, and asked to choose whether they would henceforth fight for the possession of Sicily or in defense of their own hearths and homes, moved westward along the shore in good spirits and order. They hove in sight of the enemy, as it would seem, to the west of the promontory of Ecnomus, and observing the fourfold division of the Roman armament, they divided their own fleet into a similar number of squadrons. The Carthaginian admirals, in order to detach the first two squadrons of the Roman fleet from the third, which was retarded by the transports, arranged that the part of their line which should be first attacked by the thin end of the Roman wedge should give way before it and feign a flight. The stratagem was partially successful, for the flying Carthaginian ships, wheeling round suddenly, closed in upon the sides of the Roman triangle, which had pursued them too far, and by their superior rapidity and skill seriously threatened its safety. But the knowledge that they were fighting under the immediate eye of the consuls, and the confidence inspired in them by the possession of the Raven, enabled the Romans to hold their own till Hamilcar, in sheer exhaustion, was compelled to save himself by flight. Meanwhile, a fierce double combat had been raging elsewhere. Hanno, who was on the Carthaginian right, had forborne to take any part in the first onset, but keeping out to sea, as soon as the three first Roman squadrons had got well past him, had fallen upon the rear guard. Ventum erat ad triarios, and for a time it seemed as if even the triarii would give way. The Carthaginian left, which had hitherto hugged the shore in a long line at right angles to the rest of the fleet, as soon as they had got well behind the Roman position, attacked the third squadron, which was impeded by the transports. These, however, slipped the ropes and did battle with their assailants. There were thus three distinct sea fights, simultaneous and well maintained. Hamilcar, as has been said, was the first to give way, and his flight practically decided the battle. Manlius remained where he was to secure the disabled vessels, but Regulus fell back to the assistance of the Triarii, who were being hard pressed by Hanno. Hanno was put to flight, and Manlius just then coming up, both consuls together bore down on the left wing of the enemy, which, had they only been less afraid of the boarding bridges, must before this have been victorious. A few only of the Carthaginian ships escaped, but the Romans had no reason to despise their foes, for once more they owed the victory not so much to their naval skill as to their boarding bridges. Still, their victory was complete, and there was now nothing left to bar the conquerors from Africa. Page 105, end of chapter 5. I think we'll stop here. Invasion of Africa will be taken up in the next video.